Professor Monroe again, and in this video we're going to talk briefly about rule utilitarianism. You'll recall in a previous video we discussed act utilitarianism, which is a view that says you should focus your attention on what you need to do to make a decision now, and was less concerned with personal character or larger social rules. And you may recall we discussed that there are some problems with act utilitarianism, particularly one that's bothersome to folks is this lack of moral absolutes, that there are things that are absolutely right or wrong and aren't right or wrong relative to outcomes. We can think of rule utilitarianism, at least in some respects, as an attempt to overcome the shortcomings of act utilitarianism. How can we fix it to make the theory better, in other words? Particularly this problem of no moral absolutes. And also, the rule utilitarian adds in the focus, what kind of rules ought we to have for a society? So the focus isn't just about what I should do in this particular circumstance. In fact, the rule utilitarian de-emphasizes that and focuses more on what kind of rules do we have or do we need to have in place from an ethical perspective in order to have a just, fair, legitimate, ethical context in which to live, a nice, well-ordered society. That's also a job of ethical theories, an important one, some might point out, isn't just to say, here's the rule that I follow when I decide how to act, but here's how we set up all these other rules that we're then obligated to follow. So, that kind of makes sense if you think about it. Right? Imagine, if you could, just for a second, a society that had no rules, guidelines, standards of any sort. Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, once pointed out that life in such a world, what he called the state of nature, would be nasty, brutish, and short, a war of all against all. The interesting and almost paradoxical thing about rules is that when we adopt them, they make us more free, and the restrictions actually make us happier than for not having these restrictions. So, for example, a society in which I can feel safe and not worry about being murdered every time I walk out of my house is probably going to be a happier society than one in which I had to fear for my life every time I hit my front door. Typically speaking, a society in which there's a justice system that gives everyone a fair shake ends up being happier than one where criminal penalties are assessed arbitrarily at the end of a sword. Typically speaking, societies are happier when you've got rules that preserve property and protect each other from theft and so on. So you kind of get the point that rules, while sometimes we chafe under their weight, actually exist, for the most part, to benefit us. And that ought to be our focus, says the rule utilitarian. It's the rules themselves and the having of these rules that tends to produce the greatest possible balance of happiness over unhappiness, much more so than anything that any one individual could do independently. Right? So having traffic regulations makes us happier as a society because everything runs more smoothly and so forth and so on. If you've ever been to a country that doesn't have traffic regulations, you know what I'm talking about. But when it comes down to it, says the rule utilitarian, that ought to be our focus, that we put the right rules into place so that our society is happier that way, rather than me focusing on what I should do at any given time. Once we have the right set of rules, then our job is primarily just to follow those rules, because the rules themselves do the work of promoting overall societal happiness. Now that raises a really important question. Lots of societies have rules, and many societies have rules that aren't good. How do we determine which are the good rules in our society and separate those from the bad rules in our society, ones that don't promote happiness, you might say? Well, the rule utilitarian says here's where the greatest happiness principle, the utility principle, comes into play. It isn't so much that we use that principle to weigh out our individual actions. Rather, what we do is we assess the rules we put in place in society against that ultimate standard. Does having this rule actually make people happier rather than unhappy? If the answer is yes, then it's a good rule and we ought to follow it. If the answer is no, then it's a bad rule and we ought to get rid of it. So the role of the utility principle for the rule utilitarian isn't so much action guidance as it is rule adoption. We use that to decide which are the good rules and which are the bad rules. And then once we have those in place, our job is to follow the good rules. Notice how this approximates moral absolutes. It may be the case that in a specific circumstance, it might make more people happy than unhappy to murder someone. But typically speaking, rules against killing people who haven't done anything will make us happier than allowing one-off exceptions. So while a specific action might make more people happy in the short term, having these big picture rules makes us happier in the long term. So we get at the moral absolutes like not killing or not stealing or not lying by our adherence to these general rules that tend to make society better off. There are some problems with rule utilitarianism, just as there are some problems with act utilitarianism. Critics on the non-consequentialist side of things will say, what do you mean that approximates moral absolutes? Just having rules doesn't quite get you to what we mean, the non-consequentialist would say, when we say that there are absolute moral standards, which is to say rules about ethics that don't change, that they're part of how you ought to act no matter what. The rule utilitarian seems to put that into place, but the fact is the rules can change at any time. Rules come and go according to the extent that they affect happiness. So take, for example, prohibition. At first, people thought it would make us happier to get rid of alcohol, and then over time, it turns out that that was wrong, and the rules shift. Well, the non-consequentialists say that's not much of an absolute. In fact, all that means is that our rules are as relative to our happiness as anything else. So not really an absolute in that sense. Also, act utilitarians raise the problem, what should you do when following rules actually conflicts with promoting happiness in a specific circumstance? If the point of the theory is to make good consequences happen, and in sometimes following the rule produces bad consequences, doesn't it seem, in some sense, like rule utilitarianism has lost its consequentialist basis? That is to say, if it's true that following a rule will make more people unhappy than happy, at least even in one circumstance, doesn't that seem to contradict the utility principle that says what we ought to do is promote the most happiness now? These are some problems that the rule utilitarian faces. Like all theories, there are problems with it, but in the next video, we'll focus on how to apply this theory.